Hey folks, the next lecture that we're going to be working through is evolutionary mechanisms of natural selection. So natural selection is a law. So if you don't remember or you haven't learned this, a law is a description. So if you remember, a theory is an explanation, a law is a description. And so natural selection in particular describes how traits that are beneficial in terms of fitness, which we'll talk about a little bit later, will increase in the population over generations. And we can gain evidence for this law, which is what makes it a law instead of a hypothesis, by tracking trends of how these genetic variations change in proportion over time. So again, just to reiterate the difference between laws and theories, laws describe, and theories, like when we went through the theory of evolution and why it was a theory, it explains. So you can see in the middle though, this is very important. They're both based on a significant amount of evidence and they cannot change into each other. So a theory that gains a lot more evidence will never become a law, and a law would never become a theory. They're equally valid, they just do different things for us. So the short version that we often learn first in regards to natural selection is survival of the fittest. This isn't an incorrect description, but it's not really a full definition. So if we break this up a little bit, when we look at survival, we're looking at the increase in numbers of a certain trait or version. And when we look at fittest, what we're talking about is fitness referring to those organisms that are the best at reproduction. So that means that those traits that are beneficial towards that reproduction will increase over time, as we suggested in our description. So we always talk about randomness and variability with our mechanisms. And so in this case, we would consider natural selection to be non-random. And this is because if we know enough about the environment and about individuals' traits, we can actually predict whether we think those traits would increase or decrease over time in the population. So if we see over here our good friend Olaf, who is made of snow, and we know that this is a sunny beach, it would be fairly easy to predict that survival is not going to be high on the list here for this guy. For a more realistic example, if we look down at these giraffes, if we know that they need to eat leaves to survive, which is necessary for reproduction, we can tell that this taller one here is going to be a lot more successful because they can reach the leaves up here, and so we would expect the genes that this one carries for height to increase over time. So the traits themselves do come from mutations, and mutation is always the first mechanism that happens when we develop new traits. And mutations are random, but the selection process that comes after is not random. So remember, it's predictable. One of the things to clarify for natural selection is that it is non-Lamarcian. So we often find ourselves saying things like the giraffes, the length of the next giraffes increased in order to allow them to eat leaves. That would be incorrect wording because it implies that they were thoughtfully trying to stretch their necks out, and over generations that caused them to become longer. My favorite example of this is if you think of someone who's really fit like a bodybuilder, they may not pass on, they're not going to have a baby that has huge muscles, right? They may pass on the probability of being able to build muscle a certain way, but they won't actually have that trait. On the other hand, if there's genes that go into height, and we see on this hand, again, our tall giraffe is being more successful, this giraffe is most likely to reproduce, and then that's what's going to increase the height in the next generation. That doesn't necessarily mean it will keep increasing, it just means that this one is most successful right now. We also talk about variability with all of our mechanisms. And natural selection decreases genetic variability. This is sometimes a little bit hard for people to wrap their heads around because we think of selection as deciding of traits, and that's what makes traits different in one area than another. But within a population, we would consider perfect variability to be equal numbers of every type. So in our little circle population here, we have white, light gray, and dark gray. And so perfect variability is one of each. But as mutation and reproduction and selection occurs, like in this picture, at the bottom, we have 2 light gray and 3 dark gray. And so that has moved away from equal numbers of each, and we've actually entirely lost the white circle. And so anything that moves it away from equal numbers is considered a decrease in variability. You can also think of it like narrowing down. So if there's a big diversity in the population, and for some reason the white circles just don't survive as well, but the dark gray and the light gray circles do, we're sort of narrowing down which ones can reproduce more. So narrowing down is like a decrease. Okay, and the last point to talk about is we often hear the word adapt or adaptation. I've had a lot of students that use adapt and they accidentally use it incorrectly. And that's because they're using it as a verb, as an action. And this is often used incorrectly because we tend to imply that the changes are intentional, like we said with the Lamarckian view with the giraffes. So when you say they adapt, the other part of the sentence you may not say is in order to. We are very human-centric in our understanding of the world, and so we do adapt. We can change what we're doing in order to fit the environment, but that's not always the case for other organisms. But instead, what you can say is adaptation. And so that is a noun, and it's specific to a trait that has evolved and been maintained in the population through mutation and natural selection. So an adaptation is something that has been beneficial, and that's why it's still there. Okay, so just to sum up and remind you of all the important points. So remember, natural selection, otherwise known as survival of the fittest, if we're giving a better description, is a description of how certain traits that are beneficial for fitness will increase in the population over time. Natural selection is non-random because there are certain aspects that we can predict fairly easily with enough information, and it decreases variability because it's sort of narrowing down or weeding out traits that would be less beneficial for reproduction. I hope that helps you with natural selection.